On a quiet spring evening in the mid-1990s, the city of Provo, Utah, looked like any other peaceful college town in America. The streets around the university campus were calm, and students moved between apartments, libraries, and late-night study sessions. It was the kind of place where people believed nothing truly terrible could happen. That belief would soon be tested. One night, a 21-year-old university student left a friend's apartment and began walking home. The distance was short, only a few minutes on foot. It was a route she knew well, a path she had taken many times before. But on this night, she never reached her destination. When friends realized she hadn't returned home, concern slowly began to spread. At first, people assumed there must be a simple explanation. Perhaps she had stopped somewhere along the way, or maybe plans had changed unexpectedly. As the hours passed with no contact, worry turned into something much heavier. Soon, a missing person report was filed, and the quiet university community began searching for answers. Days later, the investigation took a tragic turn. In a remote section of Canyonland outside the city, authorities made a discovery that confirmed the worst fears of everyone involved. A young student had been killed. The location where she was found was isolated and difficult to reach, surrounded by rugged terrain and desert vegetation. Investigators carefully documented the scene, collecting every piece of evidence they could find. At the time, detectives believed the key to the case might lie within those small fragments of physical evidence. But the tools available to analyze them were limited. In the mid-1990s, forensic DNA technology was still developing. Laboratories could analyze genetic material, but the process required larger and cleaner samples than what investigators often recovered from outdoor crime scenes. In this case, the available material was extremely small and had been exposed to the elements. The samples were collected and preserved, but the laboratory results failed to produce a clear genetic profile. Without that profile, investigators had no direct way to identify the person responsible. Despite conducting hundreds of interviews and following numerous leads, detectives could not find a suspect. Eventually, the case entered what law enforcement calls the cold case stage. For the victim's family, that phrase carried enormous weight. It meant the investigation would continue, but the pace would slow. Leads would become rare. The search for answers would stretch into an uncertain future. Years passed. The evidence remained carefully stored inside police archives, preserved in the hope that one day technology might advance far enough to reveal something investigators had previously been unable to see. Meanwhile, forensic science continued evolving. Across the world, scientists were developing new methods for extracting and analyzing DNA. Laboratories learned how to recover genetic material from smaller samples, and even from microscopic skin cells left behind through simple contact. What once required a visible stain could now be detected from traces nearly invisible to the human eye. As these breakthroughs occurred, cold case investigators began reopening older files. Cases that had once seemed impossible suddenly had new possibilities. The investigation into the young student's death was among those revisited. Over the years, forensic specialists repeatedly returned to the preserved evidence. Each new test represented another attempt to unlock information hidden inside samples collected decades earlier. For a long time, the results remained inconclusive. But eventually, the technology reached a point where scientists could attempt something that had not been possible. During the original investigation, instead of focusing only on obvious biological material, they began searching for microscopic skin cells trapped in clothing fibers. These tiny fragments of DNA are known as touch DNA. Even the briefest contact between two people can leave behind enough cells to identify someone with extraordinary precision. When the evidence was re-examined using these modern techniques, a partial genetic profile finally began to appear. After additional analysis and verification, the profile became strong enough to compare against national criminal databases. Those databases had grown enormously since the 1990s, now containing millions of DNA records connected to criminal investigations across the country. When investigators submitted the newly generated profile, they waited for the system to complete its comparison. The result changed everything. The DNA matched a man whose genetic profile was already stored within the system. He was not an unknown traveler passing through town decades earlier. He was someone who had already been involved in violent crimes. In fact, at the time the match was discovered, he was already serving a prison sentence. The microscopic evidence collected many years earlier had finally revealed his identity. For investigators, the realization was both satisfying and unsettling. The answer had been hidden in the evidence from the beginning. It had simply taken decades for science to become capable of reading it. When prosecutors reviewed the findings, the strength of the DNA match was overwhelming. The probability of the profile belonging to anyone else was astronomically small. Faced with this evidence, the suspect eventually accepted responsibility for the crime. The case that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved finally reached its conclusion. For the victim's family, the resolution came after more than 2 decades of uncertainty and unanswered questions. Although nothing could undo what had happened, the identification of the person responsible provided a sense of long-awaited closure. For law enforcement, the case demonstrated something equally important. It showed that time does not always erase the evidence of a crime. Sometimes the evidence remains exactly where investigators left it, waiting quietly for technology to evolve. Across the United States and around the world, thousands of similar cold cases still exist. Evidence from those investigations sits in storage rooms, preserved carefully in sealed containers. Inside some of those containers are answers that have not yet been discovered. Advances in forensic science continue pushing the boundaries of what is possible. Techniques such as genetic genealogy, ultrasensitive DNA extraction, and new analytical tools are helping investigators reopen cases that once appeared permanently unsolved. Each breakthrough brings the possibility that another long-hidden truth may finally come to light. The story of this investigation is not just about one crime. It is about the slow intersection of science, patience, and justice. A single piece of microscopic evidence, nearly invisible to the naked eye, ultimately carried the truth across decades. And when the technology finally caught up, that evidence spoke for someone who no longer could. In the end, the walk that began on a quiet night in a peaceful college town never reached its intended destination. But many years later, the truth found its way there instead.